Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 3.
Picture a private jet cutting through the night sky. Its destination, a speck of an island in the Caribbean called Little St. James. On board are powerful men whose name you know, a former president, a prince, a billionaire. Below, waiting in the shadows, young girls, some barely teens, flown in like cargo for parties where the cameras never stop rolling. This is no conspiracy theory. It's just a momentary snapshot in the life of Jeffery Epstein, a life laid bare in flight logs, victim testimonies, and a 2008 sweetheart deal that let him walk free, while the truth of what was taking place was locked away and buried. From court filings and my research, Virginia Jeffery, a survivor who took Prince Andrews to court for his role in her abuse, described being, quote, passed around like a party favor to men whose positions and power shielded them. Like all of those stories of elite pedophile rings, Epstein was sold to us as an isolated case. Just one man's depravity, a bad egg, and those who just got too close and were swept up in the controversy. But what if Epstein, and others like it, aren't just isolated anomalies? What if they are just a single thread in a web stretching back for decades? A web we saw woven through the heart of Omaha's Franklin scandal. A story I've spent 2 episodes now uncovering and exposing, a network of abused kids, buried evidence, and elite protection. The web doesn't stop there though. It reaches into Belgium's basements, where Mark Dutroux, who we spoke of last season, kept his victims chained up, begging for help, while police just ignored leads, and despite every sign pointing to a much larger conspiracy, every attempt at investigating and exposing the broader network were immediately shut down. And even those who did dare to look were quickly silenced. The web continues though. It snakes through Portugal's orphanages, Ireland's boys' homes, and even a California preschool with tunnels that no one wanted found. Each scandal carries the same fingerprints, intelligence agencies pulling strings, money flowing through fake charities and grants, law enforcement looking away, just sold as ineptitude. And beneath nearly all of them were whispers of rituals too dark to believe. Tonight I bring you the final chapter in our investigative deep dive into Franklin, where we will step back from the corkboard and follow the wider evidence, not through my opinions, but the documents, the testimonies, the hard-to-dispute facts. Tonight we will unravel how these seemingly disparate cases overlap and connect, not as the isolated horrors that they were sold to us as, but as a part of a complex system, a system that traffics the most vulnerable to control the most powerful, a system that uses fear, intimidation, law enforcement, media, and even murder to ensure that the voiceless remain silenced, unless we keep digging and fighting for them. Tonight, we are pulling at every thread to try and expose what's been hidden for far too long. From Epstein's connections to suppressed FBI files, the truth is far stranger and so much darker than the lies that you've been sold. Buckle up, because this isn't just a story. It's a call to see the world as it is, and maybe, somehow, change it one day for those who need our voice, who truly deserve it. A new story is being written every single day, and my hope is that by better understanding how and why it keeps happening, that we can spot the next one a little bit quicker, speak up a little bit louder, and work just a little bit harder to ensure that next time, justice arrives on time. Welcome back to Clandestine Radio for our conclusion of the Franklin cover-up. This is Season 3, Episode 8, Threads of Corruption. Chapter 1. Epstein. When I sat down to finally write this all out, I struggled with where to start it. Do I start at the end with how his improbable rise was overshadowed by his even less probable death? Do I start with where he first really hit everyone's radar in 2008 when his sweetheart deal opened up a massive can of worms and drew many eyes onto his involvement with intelligence agencies and operations? Or should it begin where his first victim spoke out? As complex as the Epstein case is, and as deep as it runs, I decided the only real way to tell it, even this abbreviated version, was to go back to where he started, but try to stick to only what's important. Sure, he was born to a Jewish working-class family on January 20th of 1953 in Brooklyn, and he and his brother, Mark, grew up in what was considered to be a working-class neighborhood, by New York standards at least, called Seagate, a private gated community in Coney Island. Sure, he was quiet and nerdy in school and graduated at 16. And sure, he started playing piano at 5 and was considered talented by most. But none of that tells us anything about who he really was, or why, and how he became what he did. As far as I can tell, that story, like ours, begins when he turned 21 and supposedly swindled former U.S. Attorney General William Barr's father, Donald, and despite lying on his resume and being woefully underqualified, was able to land a teaching position at the Dalton School in New York, an esteemed private college prep school that could have had its pick of best and brightest for its staff. To tell that part, though, we have to also look at who Donald Barr actually was. Also born into a Jewish family, Barr would later convert to Catholicism. One of Donald's first jobs was serving in the OSS, the progenitor to the CIA. Formed June 13, 1942, it was designed to coordinate espionage activities behind enemy lines in World War II and to gain a strategic edge through the use of propaganda, subversion, and, later, post-war planning, before being officially dissolved 1 month after the end of World War II. After which, Donald returned to Columbia University, earning a master's in English before going on to become a teacher, and then worked as the headmaster when he was brought on at Dalton School in '64. In 1973, 1 year before he would hire Epstein, Donald Barr would publish his sci-fi novel titled Space Relations, a book that was filled with graphic depictions of a planet ruled by oligarchs who engaged in child sex slavery. The following year, in 1974, he would hire Jeffery Epstein, a man whose life would go on to hauntingly mirror those very depictions. Epstein, as I mentioned, was underqualified for such a position, and only 21 at the time. His resume, fraudulent, as it would seem to always be, but more on that in a bit. Epstein had dropped out of both colleges that he'd attended, Cooper Union as well as NYU's Courant Institute, never even earning a degree. But despite that, he would later have an office at Harvard. Epstein would allegedly begin showing his true colors around this time with inappropriate behavior towards several of his underage female students. This would do very little to slow his ascent, however, and soon he would become connected with Alan Greenberg, whose son and daughter attended the school. Greenberg at the time was the CEO of Bear Stearns, one of the most powerful investment banks at that time. When Epstein would be fired from Dalton 2 years after he started for a, quote, poor performance, Greenberg would offer him a job at Bear Stearns. He would start in '76 as just a low-level junior assistant to a floor trader, but he would quickly worm his way right up the ladder, where he would begin advising, and not just anyone who came in the door, but some of the biggest clients that they had, making even more elite connections and networking. He would be asked to leave in '81 following, according to his deposition and sworn testimony, being guilty of a Regulation D violation, which is a regulation of the Securities Act. It's basically like selling securities without SEC oversight and registry. It's not really important enough to get into. Just know that his shadier side was already there. He would remain a client of Bear Stearns, though, up until his epic 2008 collapse. He would then start his own consulting firm, International Assets Group, or IAG, which is a whole side rabbit hole that we honestly don't have time to even get into. It would also be around this time when he would begin frequently traveling between the US, Europe, and the Middle East, where in 1987 he would join Stephen Hoffenberg at Towers Financial Group after being introduced by British defense contractor and suspected MI5 asset Douglas Leese, who would make the introduction describing Epstein as a, quote, financial genius with no moral compass. He, Epstein, would also begin telling people around this time that he was an intelligence asset. Hoffenberg, who Epstein would later leave holding the bag in a massive Ponzi scheme, alleged in 2020 that Epstein had been recruited in the 80s to work with British intelligence by lease. But it was Hoffenberg who introduced Epstein to the Mossad, MI5, and KGB super spy Robert Maxwell. The Epstein-Hoffenberg Ponzi scheme defrauded its investors of a whopping $460 million. Hoffenberg would get convicted to 18 years in prison for his part of the role, but Epstein, well, he walked away unscathed despite, according to Hoff, being the architect of the whole operation and using the scheme to help build his massive fortune. A preponderance of evidence pulled from court docs and interviews seems to support that this was a key source of wealth early on. By 87, Epstein had launched J. Epstein & Co., later called Financial Trust Co., managing assets but only for billionaires. His most prominent and potentially only client, as far as I could tell, was Leslie Lex Wexner, a business mogul who had started brands like Express and would go on to acquire Victoria's Secret early in its life, as well as a long list of other successful companies under L Brands. Wexner was also a powerful Jewish billionaire who funded, along with Charles Bronfman, something called the Mega Group in 91. The Mega Group, comprised exclusively of Jewish elite billionaires, functioned as, among other things, a pro-Zionist lobby similar to AIPAC, with aims of influencing U.S. policy decisions and funding pro-Zionist projects. And also in 87, a year after first meeting him, mind you, Wexner would not only appoint Epstein as his financial advisor, but he would give Epstein full power of attorney in 91, turning the proverbial, and in some cases literal, keys to his kingdom and enormous wealth over to Epstein. This gave old Epi, and Epi alone, full power to hire and fire, to write and sign checks on his account, to buy and sell properties, borrow money, and execute any other acts of a legally binding nature on Wexner's behalf, and without his knowledge or even his express consent, which, above all, gave Wexner plausible deniability, an intel agency favorite in regards to any activities that Epstein did. This role wasn't briefly lived either. By 95, Epstein became director of the Wexner Foundation and president of Wexner's Property, the real estate arm of his empire. Aside from the definitively not suspicious and I'm sure totally innocent and above-board relationships, in 95 or 96, Wexner would transfer the title to his massive Manhattan townhouse at 9 East 71st Street that he had paid $13.2 million for in 89 when it was in dire shape, and then heavily invested in renovations for it, which was one of the largest private homes in New York, by the way, and valued at up to $77 million when Epstein lived there, to Epstein for the whopping and also definitely not suspicious grand total of $0. Yep, you heard that correctly. He would use the home to host elites, and when it was raided in 2019, it would be revealed that the home was fully wired with hidden cameras, allegedly being used to capture blackmail. Worth noting, aside from the long list of elite visitors, he frequently hosted former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, as well as current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Other properties that he owned were also gifted to or sold at well below market value by Wexner, including a 10,000 square foot home in Columbus, Ohio, as well as an East 66th Street condo building, also in Manhattan, where Epstein would house young women and models. Wexner gifted Epstein properties, planes, including the infamous Lolita Express, and influence. He did not, however, account for Epstein's massive fortune, estimated at between $500 and $600 million at the time of his death, money that largely lacks any clear origins. Inferences based on victim testimonies and logs, however, point towards blackmail, i.e. hidden cameras in his houses recording elites with underage girls, with him leveraging that compromat for investments or favors. In 1998, Epstein would purchase an entire island, officially named Little St. James, but more widely known as Pedophile Island, complete with temples and underground tunnels, rooms, and facilities. He would also acquire a property in New Mexico called Zorro Ranch, comprised of up to 10,000 acres where alleged breeding experiments took place. These allegations stem from reports of his open interest in eugenics and transhumanism, where he discussed impregnating multiple women with his sperm to seed or improve the human race with his DNA. This stemming from a 2019 New York Times article. It would also be, without real dispute, one of the many properties in his portfolio where sexual abuse and likely further blackmail gathering was taking place. All of his endeavors were funded from questionable offshore accounts and foundations or shell companies. Back to Epstein and Maxwell, though. We discussed Robert Maxwell previously in last season's 3-part deep dive into the Promise Octopus story and the death of Danny Casolaro, so I won't really retread that any more than I have to here. All that really matters is that he was a known spy with deep connections to Mossad, among other intel agencies. What is important for this story is that Robert Maxwell introduced Ghislaine to Jeffrey when she was 20 years old, and it was also Robert that introduced him to another name you will recognize from the Promise story, former high-ranking Israeli intelligence official Ari Ben-Menashe, who also played major roles in the Iran portion of the Iran-Contra affair by brokering massive arms deals between Israel and Iran, as well as being part of Israel's decision to back Reagan and assist in his quote-unquote October surprise to ensure that American hostages that were held by Iran weren't released in time to benefit the incumbent president Jimmy Carter, but instead to strengthen Reagan's image once he took office. Now we come to the interesting stuff. Thank you for bearing with me while I filled in the background, by the way. I know this is what you're here for, though, and don't worry, I've got all the dirt that you're really looking for, including why Epstein got that sweetheart deal in 2008, and why, according to Menashe and others, Trump and the U.S. are helpless to stop the genocide in Gaza. And trust me, it's definitely not because they are our greatest ally, or because of some misguided Christian belief that God said that they can do what they want, and it certainly isn't because of October 7th. We will get there in a minute, though. So Maxwell introduces Epstein to Ben-Menashe and wants to involve him in dealings that they had related to the Israeli-Iranian arms deals, and tells Menashe that, quote, "Your Israeli bosses approved." So the decision to involve Epstein came down from above Maxwell, apparently. Epstein wasn't considered very competent by Israeli intelligence, though, and therefore wasn't directly involved with the Iran deals. He and Ghislaine, however, would be involved with Mossad in other ways. Starting sometime in the early to mid-90s, the pair would begin working as low-level operators, setting up and running a massive blackmail operation, ensnaring U.S. politicians, public figures, and prominent scientists. While the honey trap has been around since the days of Samson and Delilah, and utilized perfection by the Mafia, then the CIA, along with every other intel service around the planet in some capacity, what they were doing was far more insidious. While being caught with a prostitute or having gay sex would be potentially devastating to a target's family and public image back in the day, maybe even their career, getting caught doing such with a 14-year-old or even younger in many cases wasn't just image and career suicide, it was illegal, and the absolute last thing that anyone, much less a prominent public figure, would likely ever want to be exposed about them. If you want the supporting evidence for this claim, you'll find some of that in the document dump this week. This is also supported by a preponderance of the circumstantial evidence and common sense. Epstein openly claimed Mossad/CIA ties as far back as the late 80s, which on the surface is pretty meaningless since it hinges on trusting his word. But still, even he admitted it, and that it was a honey trap for compromise on world leaders. Aside from that, you get into Robert Maxwell's connections, Epstein's unexplained access to the elite, and in many cases the elite of the elite, and world leaders, and then there is the strange case of the 2008 sweetheart deal. While the vast majority of the information out there focuses on the detail and outcome of his court case in Palm Beach in 2008, the charges go a little further back. In March of 2005, police in Palm Beach began digging into Epstein when the family of a 14-year-old girl would go to them to report that their daughter was molested by Epstein at his mansion. This would open a floodgate of other underage girls giving similar reports to the police. In May of the following year, Palm Beach police had gathered enough evidence to move forward with charging Epstein with multiple counts of unlawful sex with a minor. Then, in a highly unusual turn of events, State Attorney Barry Kreischer, also Jewish, though I'm sure that has nothing to do with it, would step in and instead send the case to the grand jury. Before I tell you how that went, let's dig into Barry for a sec. Barry has had a number of, shall we say, interesting cases in his career, many gaining brief but national attention, including one where a special needs child was accused of stealing $2 from a classmate. Barry charged him with strong-arm robbery, extortion, and petty theft, and all of this in an adult court proceeding. He was in 8th grade and had an IQ of 58 for the record. There's also a fatal hit-and-run case where he swung wildly in the other direction and helped actively shield that driver's identity from law enforcement for years. So without risking legal repercussions for saying baseless things like he seems as crooked as the day is long, I'll just say that his record is interesting. Important to note in him sending Epstein's case to the grand jury as that this was the first time for a Florida grand jury to ever consider a sex crime. During the hearing, only 2 victims out of the nearly 24 young women and underage girls who had accused Epstein were actually called to testify, and a prosecutor with close ties to old Barry Kreischer called both of them a prostitute in front of the grand jurors, and Assistant State Attorney to Kreischer, Lana Belolovec, asked one of them whether she was aware that she had committed a crime. The grand jury would indict Epstein on only a single crime of solicitation of prostitution. You know, what would be charged if you went and picked up an adult hooker and got busted, and a charge with zero reflection of the young age of the victims who were legally too young to even consent according to state law. An additional charge would emerge in the wake of the outrage from the victims' families, and to spare another long trial or probably discovery, Epstein would plead guilty to a single additional charge of procuring a minor for prostitution. This was part of his sweetheart plea deal that shielded him, and perhaps more importantly, his accomplices, known or unknown, from facing the 60-count federal indictment, which was done with Kreischer's approval. Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Ryder would even voice concerns to Kreischer regarding his prosecution of the case, calling the state attorney's office's treatment of the case, quote, highly unusual. It's easy to understand why he would feel that way after he had delivered solid evidence of nearly 24 victims, the majority minors, who all had told very similar accounts of the abuse that they suffered, only for Kreischer to send it to a grand jury and by all accounts help his assistant state attorney tank the case. Ryder would turn the evidence over to the FBI once he saw the writing on the wall, and the FBI would then open a probe into the case, one that would be shut down when former U.S. Attorney for Florida, Alexander Acosta, would negotiate Epstein's plea deal behind closed doors in secret and without informing any of his victims, which is illegal. The plea deal included immunity from the federal charges. Acosta would come under fire for the move, and in 2019 he would publicly defend the decision, saying that it, quote, came down from above his head and he was told, quote, Epstein belonged to intelligence. It was above his pay grade and to leave it alone. After serving a very easy sentence in a jail where he was allowed to just leave during the day and do whatever he wanted to do, basically, he would be done with it in no time and then continue to assault victims and provide victims to elites all the way up until 2019. Now, let's fast forward to 2019 when his properties are raided and he would be arrested for the final time. According to documents obtained from the DOJ that you will find in the cache of case documents in the Discord, one of the more interesting finds during the raids of the New York mansion was a safe that contained discs that were labeled, quote, young female, and then a name, plus, and then a name of a prominent person. The FBI would confiscate the contents, which were also said to contain photographs of important men and underage girls. In 2018, Epstein himself would tell a New York Times reporter, quote-unquote off record, that he had dirt on powerful people, including information about their sexual proclivities and recreational drug use. And there are many in the department that feel that the 2019 raids were a direct response by those powerful people in an attempt to retrieve that quote-unquote dirt that he had admitted to having. Later events would only seem to further strengthen that belief. The 2 charges that Epstein was arrested and indicted for were federal charges of sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking of minors. Keep that in mind as we go through this last part. Epstein's arraignment would take place on July 8th of 2019, where he would enter a plea of not guilty and was ordered to be held in the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City. Days later, Alexander Acosta would resign as labor secretary amid public outrage over the role that he played in allowing Epstein to continue to operate all the way up until his arrest in 2019. The upcoming case would build its own ecosystem of speculation and anticipation of finally getting the details of his extensive and well-connected operation. On January 18th, Epstein would be denied bail after offering $600,000 if he would be able to just wear an ankle monitor at his New York mansion, but it would be denied due to his strong potential as a flight risk, which brings up the final anomalies. And the early morning of July 23, 2019, at 1:27 a.m., when it's reported that Epstein was found semi-conscious in his cell with injuries to his neck. Prison officials would immediately question his cellmate, a multiple homicide and drug conspiracy suspect named Nicholas Tartaglione, who would naturally deny hanging Epstein. It's been widely reported that Epstein was suicidal, or that he staged it to get a transfer, but a source close to the case would report that he told his attorneys Tartaglione was responsible for it, and he felt that, quote, they're trying to kill me. Spencer Kevin, an attorney who represented 3 of Epstein's alleged victims, was quoted that same month saying that he believed firmly that this was an attempt on his life and that there was a high probability that he would be murdered in prison. As a result of this incident, Epstein was placed on suicide watch. After 6 days of observation, however, he would be taken off following a psychological examination. He was returned to the SHU Special Housing Unit, where he was to have a cellmate and be checked on every 30 minutes. On August 8th, Epstein expressed more fears to his attorneys and asked for a last will and testament to be drawn up. He would sign it in front of 2 attorneys that afternoon, appointing 2 longtime employees as executives and gifted all of his assets to a trust. The very next day, Epstein's cellmate was transferred out of the cell and no replacement was brought in. That same day, August 9th, Epstein would meet with his lawyers who described him as being upbeat and positive before he was escorted back to the SHU at 7:49 p.m. by guard Tova Noel. Now for the anomalies. Every precautionary rule seemingly went out the window that night. He wasn't checked on, much less on the standard 30-minute window. The last time a guard even walked by his cell was at 10:30 p.m. The 2 guards that were assigned to check on him every 30 minutes reportedly just fell asleep at their desk for about 3 hours, and later would falsify records in an attempt to cover that up. The 2 cameras that were directly in front of Epstein's cell, which seemed to work fine earlier in the day, would mysteriously malfunction, while another camera, providing a longer shot of that area, had corrupted footage that was deemed unusable. Shortly after 6 a.m. on August 10th, guards handing out breakfast would discover him unresponsive in his cell and in a cardiac arrest state. He was alleged to have been found in a kneeling position with a strap of bedsheet wrapped around his neck and then tied to the top bunk. It's believed that he had been dead for 2 hours or so at this point. Guards would reportedly perform CPR and then pull the alarm 3 minutes later. He would be rushed to Newark Downtown Hospital, where he'd be pronounced dead on the scene at 6:39 a.m., just 9 minutes after he was alleged to have been discovered. Now, aside from the glaring oddities that I had to mention while just giving out the official narrative of the events, let's dig into how comically unlikely it is that all of that occurred the way that they said it occurred, and the list of reasons that we have to question it. Setting the guards' unusual behavior and the camera anomalies aside for a sec, let's get a few things out of the way off top. This was the first death in 21 years that was ruled to be a suicide at MCC, a jail that everyone who has spent any time in has come out and said that it was impossible to commit suicide in. When they removed Epstein's body from his cell, disturbing the scene and destroying any potential evidence, it was a direct violation of the Bureau of Prisons, or BOP, protocol, which mandates that the scene of any death, including a suspected suicide, must be treated with, quote, the same level of protection as any crime scene in which a death has occurred. They also failed to take any photos to prove how his body was found. Speaking of his body, which was just under 6 feet tall and weighed 185 pounds at the time, would have been very, very difficult trying to hang himself from a bunk that was about 4 feet off the ground, at the tallest height that anything could possibly be tied to it, meaning that he didn't hang himself. He would have had to, at best, sit down and lean into it, slowly suffocating himself, which, if taken at face value, would be a monumental feat of determination. Leaked photos of the scene after his removal, but supposedly before anything else was touched, show medicine bottles standing upright at the top of the bunk, so he would have had to have also been very careful while he was doing so. An autopsy would be performed by New York City's Chief Medical Examiner Barbara Sampson on August 11th, which lasted for 4 hours. His defense team would send in well-known pathologist Michael Baden to observe the procedure. Why is Michael Baden so well known, I hear you asking? Well, for one, he was involved in one way or another with the autopsies of names that you might recognize, such as Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King Jr., JFK, George Floyd, just to name a few. And he served as New York City's Chief Medical Examiner and Chairman of the Forensic Pathology Panel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and was called in as an expert witness in the O.J. Simpson trial. Not saying any of that means anything, just, let's say, a fun fact for you. The autopsy results would determine that it was suicide by hanging. Epstein's lawyers would release a joint statement voicing concerns and dissatisfaction with the results of the autopsy. They also said that they fully intended to continue their own investigation into the circumstances and cause of his death, and would later say that the evidence concerning his death was, quote, far more consistent with murder than an alleged suicide. After observing his autopsy, Baden would tell them that he couldn't comment on it due to a gag order that was immediately put in place by Sampson's office. On October 30th of 2019, however, he would issue a report stating that Epstein's neck injuries were much more consistent with, quote, homicidal strangulation than suicide, citing the fact that Epstein, quote, had 2 fractures to the left and right side of his larynx, specifically the thyroid cartilage or Adam's apple, as well as 1 fracture on the left hyoid bone. End quote. It would also state that his hyoid bone was broken in a way indicative of strangulation from behind, later adding, quote, going over 1,000 jail hanging suicides in New York City state prisons over the past 40 to 50 years, no one has had 3 fractures. According to Baden, the wound on Epstein's neck was in the center, photos confirm this, and not under the mandibles as a typical death by hanging, going on to say that it is far more common to see that when a victim is strangled by a wire or a cord, and it was much thinner than the strip of bedsheet that was used. He also noted while there was blood on Epstein's neck from it, none was present on the bedsheet that was used. With Epstein's death ruled a suicide, again, despite the broken hyoid bone and the other anomalous injuries, falsified guard logs, cameras magically failing all over the place, but interestingly enough, only the ones that were actually trained on his cell, the federal machinery that once represented hope of real answers and justice, ground to a halt. The trafficking and conspiracy charges against him were dismissed. Not debated, not transferred, not dug into any further to uncover his clients in all of this, just dropped. As if his death somehow erased all need for further accountability, leaving burning questions regarding the blackmail that he was gathering, who it was on, and who it was potentially on the behalf of. From the court docs in our research, specifically the SDNY filings from U.S. v. Jeffery Epstein 19 CR 490 RMB, prosecutors moved quickly to dismiss the indictment on August 27th, a little over 2 weeks later, citing the defendant's death as rendering further proceedings moot. Judge Richard Berman would grant it 2 days later on August 29th without fanfare or further inquiry into his many known accomplices. No trial meant no public airing of his black book, flight logs, or victim testimonies naming elites, all of which is available unredacted in the documents folder for this episode though, if you're curious. The documents I've made available to you all in one place, including transcripts and indictments, highlight how this closure shielded potential co-conspirators, closely echoing the 2008 non-prosecution agreement's blanket immunity. Victims were left with a hotline to call, 1-800-CALL-FBI, if they wanted to provide tips. But the case was closed, and all of the evidence that was seized just seemingly vanished, seemingly prioritizing ass-covering and procedural finality over justice. This pattern of abrupt endings, straight from the Franklin cover-up playbook. Witness deaths, like the strange matter of all his main accusers overdosing or dying mysteriously in the years that followed, particularly shortly before they were set to be witnesses and testify in civil or adjacent criminal proceedings. File seizures, grand juries that discredit the victims rather than working to prosecute the perpetrators. All eerily mirror how Franklin had played out. Epstein's cases weren't just dropped, like with Franklin and others. They were deliberately buried, ensuring that the web's threads and connections remained hidden and the elite names remained as redacted as legally possible for as long as they could. Fast forward to 2025 and under the same administration that prosecuted Epstein in the first place, but with a new FBI director in position, Kash Patel, who was once a vocal critic of the deep state and an advocate for releasing the Epstein files. He would oversee a review of the files and evidence of his suspicious death, a death that caused such a controversy and outrage that a full investigation was undertaken at the time. And who was in charge of federal prisons at that time, and thus in charge of investigating it? Well, none other than Donald Barr's son, Bill Barr. So, like bookends, a father gives Epstein his first break, and a break that he was woefully underqualified for. And when he dies at the end of his usefulness, his son, who was also employed by the OSS progeny agency, the CIA, is the one to close the book and to handle the next phase of the cover-up. He would, naturally, side with the original determination that it was a suicide. Now back to the most recent FBI investigation under Patel. After a fairly brief investigation, on July 7th, the DOJ and FBI would release an unsigned memo. Epstein died by suicide. No foul play, no client list, no blackmail empire, just him and his cohort, Ghislaine, as the sole perpetrators. So I guess the official line is that they just traffic victims between themselves. To try and justify and further cement this narrative, Director Patel, along with another previously very vocal critic to the official suicide narrative, Deputy Director Dan Bongino, would appear in a very uncomfortable interview on Fox News' Sunday Morning Futures, with both men looking like hostages with Stockholm Syndrome, to push the new narrative that basically just tried to confirm the old one. They would claim enhanced video, I guess from the one camera that did work around there, that didn't show his cell, and that this new magical enhanced footage showed that no one entered or left his cell, once again concluding that he killed himself after reviewing the whole file. That video would immediately come under fire though, once it was publicly released. It would seem that their underestimation of the public's intelligence would once again come to bite them in the ass, because people would immediately start pointing out the evidence of video editing software being used to stitch together what was sold to us as a complete and unedited video, as well as missing time. Pam Bondi, U.S. AG under the new Trump administration, who stated that the client lists and files were, quote, sitting on her desk for review before doing a 180 when it was time to release them and saying that they didn't exist, would attempt to explain away this glaring inconsistency by saying that it was an old system that resets nightly, and every video would have that same missing chunk of time. She would go on to say that the DOJ was searching for other footage to prove this fact, but none was ever produced. It should have been pretty simple to obtain footage from literally any other night if it always happened. Yet, they had to search for it apparently, and for some reason, it was never found. Sure, video surveillance experts were quick to speak out to cast doubt on her explanation, saying that a nightly video reset for most all recording systems would be, quote, highly unusual. As far as Epstein having no clients all of a sudden, Maxwell's 2021 conviction, as well as the case that put Epstein in the MCC to begin with, were on conspiracy to traffic minors charges, implying right there in the name that there was some sort of a network, not a duo act. The folder's court transcripts clearly detail recruiters, enablers, and elite guests on Lolita Express as well as on the island. Victim statements name politicians, billionaires, and even royals. Yet Patel's FBI shuts it all down. No broader involvement, no further disclosure, citing privacy for the victims, who fought tooth and nail to expose all of this, mind you, and sensitive content being in the videos that they would never release. The backlash to that, like the first time that this was attempted, was swift and fierce, even from Trump's most loyal corners of his base. Rumors began to swirl immediately of Patel and Bongino's resignation over AG Bondi's handling of it all. Bongino reportedly didn't show up at work the following day, furious over the memo's opacity. Epstein's own brother, Mark, ripped the conclusion as, quote, stupid, citing autopsy evidence of murder and mocking Patel's qualifications. The Democrats, sensing blood in the water, suddenly wanted to begin demanding hearings and answers, despite not making a single peep for the previous 4 years when they could have done this. They would pen letters to Patel and Bondi accusing of a cover-up. Rumors, some seemingly confirmed, began to swirl over the relationship between Trump and Epstein. By August 28th, 2 days ago at the time of my writing this, Patel and Bondi testified before Congress amid the fallout from the determination. And, update, it is September the 3rd now, and yesterday the DOJ did release some more files. It's available on the DOJ website. I haven't had a chance to go through all of it. I tried to get some of that in for what I was going to do on this episode, but it was not possible. But there's a lot of things that I just can't get into in this episode. There's just no way to fit it all in. If Epstein is of particular interest to you guys, leave a comment about it, let me know, and I wouldn't mind doing a good deep dive episode just on him. But this quote-unquote investigation whitewashes mountains of evidence, flight logs, his black book, survivor accounts in our files, dismissing conspiracy as fiction. No mention whatsoever of the labeled disc, or any of the other surveillance videos from his many properties were ever mentioned. And just like Franklin's grand jury labeling victims unreliable, or Dutroux's ignored leads and refusal to dig into the powerful connections to the crimes, a system rallies to protect itself, concluding nothing to see here, despite the massive outrage, or the many threads that say otherwise. From Epstein's shielded empire to Belgium's buried secrets, this web continues to expand. Chapter 2. Marc Dutroux. Picture a house in Marcinelle, Belgium, a quiet suburb hiding a nightmare. Beneath its floorboards, 2 girls just 8 years old, Julie Lejeune and Mélissa Rousseau, starve in a soundproof cage. Their cries struggle to come out of their weary bodies, only to then be muffled by the concrete that surrounds them. It's 1995, and police are searching the property after receiving a tip about missing children, but they hear nothing, or so they claim, and then they simply walk away. Those girls, well, by the time of their death, it was approximated that they weighed only 66 pounds combined at the time of their death. Their bodies found a year later. We discussed this story last season as part of the Real Illuminati series, but I've uncovered even more jarring details, and this story mirrors the others in this web, so let's briefly dive back in. This is the Mark Dutroux affair, not a lone predator's hideous crime, but a gateway to a protected web of elites, blackmail, and truths that were quite literally buried. The evidence you'll be hearing comes directly from the X dossier in our files for tonight, and shows a system where the voiceless suffer to keep the powerful in line. So, let's dig in. Mark Dutroux wasn't a mastermind. He was a cog in a system much larger than himself. For those who missed last season's segment, let me just quickly bring you up to speed and also give a little bit of new info for my longtime listeners. Born in 1956, Dutroux was a drifter with a rap sheet a mile long. He'd already been convicted in '89 for raping 5 girls, sentenced to 13 years, but paroled in only 3 against strong warnings by a psychologist that he had a high chance and very high likelihood of recidivism. By 1995, he's abducting children for profit, funded partly by state subsidies for his quote-unquote social work facade, a front not unlike Epstein's philanthropy or King Jr.'s charity donations to Boys Town, or literally everything that Bill Gates does. Just saying, maybe keep an eye on him. The X dossier, page 35, reveals how Dutroux's homes, all 5 of them across Belgium, were rigged with hidden cells. Sketches show a blue-painted cage in Marcinelle, bars on windows, soundproof walls. He too targeted vulnerable girls: Zulie, Melissa, Anne Marshall, Eva Lambrix, Sabine Dardine, Laetitia Delhez, all young victims of Dutroux. Between 95 and 96, at least 8 were kidnapped. Some sold to clients, others abused and killed. Here's where it gets even uglier. The dossier, pages 50 through 80, maps the abductions. Dutroux, as we discussed last time, didn't act alone. Enter Michel Nihoul, a Brussels businessman with a taste for orgies. Our files call him the linchpin, organizing parties where girls were trafficked to judges, politicians, and even royalty. Witness X1 of the dossier, Regina Loof, testifies, quote, "They took us to chateaus where men in masks watched, filmed everything for control." Her words cut deep. Children weren't just abused, like so many cases. They were used for leverage, their suffering recorded to bind the powerful. I'm sure I don't have to point out the similarities between this, Epstein's hidden cameras, or Franklin's photos of elite parties. In August of '96, Judge Jean-Marc Connerit raids Dutroux's home, rescuing Sabine and Laetitia. But within the same document, another bombshell is revealed. Police had 27 tips about Dutroux since 1993, including from his own mother, license plates, addresses, even a neighbor's report of hearing screams. In December of '95, as I described at the start of this chapter, Zulie and Melissa were still alive when police would finally be forced to check his Marcinelle home, locked just below their feet. A leaked memo reads, quote, "No sounds heard, case closed. Is it just incompetence or protection?" The contents of the dossier and case evidence suggest the latter, pointing to orders from higher-ups to let it slide and to look the other way. This case is far bigger and much darker than I can ever hope to cover in full here. But for a longer version, check out the Real Illuminati series from last season for a deeper dive on it. Here are some things that were mostly cut from that episode though, or that I hadn't connected at that point. This isn't just a Belgian tragedy. It's a thread in a much larger web that we've been unraveling throughout this series. Like Epstein's sweetheart deal, shielding co-conspirators, Dutroux's network thrived through complicity, sold as ineptitude. The dossier also hints at Belgian state security and even NATO ties, using filmed abuses for blackmail, much like Epstein's Mossad connections or Franklin's FBI complicity and its CIA whispers. The funding came from drug deals, real estate flips, and those state grants, paralleling Epstein's suspicious foundations and Franklin's drugs and embezzlement. And the rituals? X1 describes hunts in the woods with humans as prey, sacrifices at the Mothers of Darkness Chateau d'Amois, dismissed as just satanic panic, but echoed all throughout these stories. One quote says, "They filmed children running for sport, hunters in suits." And that's not fantasy when it pops up over and over from multiple sources. this. It's a pattern. When Dutroux was finally arrested, Belgium erupted. October 20th, 1996, the largest protest demonstration in the history of Belgium would blanket the streets in an ocean of people, estimated at least to have been 300,000 citizens, joined what would be called the White March, demanding answers and accountability. All the survivors indicated that powerful Belgian and UK politicians played a role in the abuse, as well as members of the Police and Special Investigations Brigade, the equivalent to Scotland Yard or the FBI here. Yet accountability was solely placed on one man. The final catalyst for the marches, though, was the October 14th decision to remove the one man who not only rescued two of the victims himself, but became one of the few pushing to look into the case's deeper connections, Judge Jean-Marc Connerat from the case, for reasons of alleged conflict of interest after he dared to attend a fundraiser for the victims. People carried signs of disgust, with many reading, "I'm ashamed to be a Belgian," all either dressed in or carrying something white, symbolizing hope and the lost innocence of the child victims. During the march, even the fire brigade would get involved, turning their hoses on the federal parliament buildings, making a statement of its need to be cleaned, which is kind of great, honestly. I low-key love that part. The Verwilligen inquiry exposed, quote, systemic failures, missing files, tipped-off suspects, and the removal of Connerat for supporting the victims. Nihul, his accomplice, well, he was acquitted of trafficking charges in 2004, despite victim X1 naming him as the, quote, party master, and his presence being all over throughout the evidence. Witness X2, a police insider, sums the affair up well with their damning statement, quote, the files were buried because they named too many powerful people, which echoes Epstein's sealed files, or the confiscating of Caradori's evidence, and redacted FBI documents pertaining to the names of others involved. So what does this all mean? A system where trafficking isn't a bug, it's a feature, keeping elites in check through blackmail. For Zhu Li, Melissa, and the other victims who can no longer speak for themselves, our voices and refusal to forget these atrocities is their only hope to be heard, to be at peace, to find the justice that escaped them in their life all those years ago, and to ensure that their deaths weren't without meaning. The dossier I included, and the WikiLeaks files that still exist, must be our map to dig deeper and demand the truth. While sadly, nothing can ever bring back the lives that were stolen far too soon, one voice, with the right information, can reach the right ears to ensure that it wasn't in vain. From dark castles in Belgium's basements, to a U.S. cult that hid in plain sight for many years, the threads keep weaving, and this web keeps growing. Chapter 3. The Finders. The year was 1987, February 4th to be exact, when a mother at a park in Tallahassee, Florida, would notice that something wasn't quite right with some of the children playing nearby, as well as with the two men who accompanied them. She saw two men in a dirty van, along with 6 children that she would describe to police as being unkept. When the Tallahassee police arrived, what they found would kick off a mystery that persists to this day. When they interviewed these children, aged 2 to 7, they would first notice their unwashed appearance, ragged clothing, bruises, and stories that would chill the bones of even seasoned detectives. The children spoke of, quote, bloodletting ceremonies, goat sacrifices, and a life without parents, only, quote-unquote, game, led by Uncle Marion. The officers would arrest the two men, but as the investigation began to expand into their homes in Washington, D.C., a CIA memo would arrive, quote, stand down, this is an internal matter. The case would vanish even quicker than it had burst into the mainstream spotlight, buried under the same red tape and denials that have silenced the other cover-ups. Despite this, their name was now known. The Finders, a cult-like group shielded by intelligence shadows, where children were found, but a much worse fate would await them, from Belgium's dank basement prisons to an American enigma that screams cover-up. We will continue to trace the threads that seemingly bind these disparate appearing cases together, and the system that not only obfuscated the truth, but quite likely fostered their creation to start with. The story of the Finders doesn't start in 87, or even in Florida, so to try and piece it together we need to go back. The Finders weren't born in darkness. They allegedly began as something much more innocent seeming. In the 1930s, a man named Marion Petty would rent 2 apartments in D.C., and according to him, he, quote, opened them up for anybody that wanted to come in, and the idea in my head was that they were going to teach me something about power, money, or sex. Petty would enter the service shortly after, serving in the U.S. Air Forces during World War II as a flight instructor, where he would first really develop an interest in experimental ideas and group dynamics. After the war in the late 40s, He worked as an Air Force civilian instructor and supervisor at an air base in Fairfax, Virginia, near D.C. This position would give him something more important than a steady salary. It would give him access to intellectual circles. Petty was still restless, though, and harbored a deep fascination with human behavior, power structures, and alternative lifestyles, all things that would go on to help shape the finders. Petty would retire from the Air Force completely in 1955 at age 35. With a pension in hand, he would never hold a traditional job ever again. Instead, Petty turned his attention to what he called the game, a lifelong experiment in human behavior, power dynamics, and the alternative lifestyle concepts that he had developed back in his service years. While I mentioned him renting apartments in D.C. in the 30s, that was according to him later in life. As far as the records that I was able to obtain go, these would be the years where he would begin renting modest apartments in northwest D.C. near Georgetown and DuPont Circle, opening up to all. These were no mere bohemian hippie crash pads, though. Petty's setups fostered fluid relationships, communal resource sharing, and boundary-pushing discussions, echoing the era's fascination with psychology and social engineering. Which brings us to some nuggets of info that many who have told this story have seemingly tended to overlook. His wife, Isabel, worked for the CIA from 52 to 61. Some records actually say 71, handling, at least on paper, stenography duties, but would travel to highly restricted areas during this period of time, such as North Korea and the Soviet Union, suggesting a much deeper involvement. It would seem to be a family affair as well, with their son working for Air America. And for anyone unaware, Air America was actually just a CIA front airline tied to covert ops in Southeast Asia. For those who have done their homework, you may already be considering the CIA program that aligns with this period of time, MKUltra, the CIA's mind control program experimenting with LSD, hypnosis, and trauma-based control in communes, universities, clinics, and prisons, just to name a few locations. Petty's groups could have served as an informal testing ground for the program, something similar to the Manson family, but obtaining substantial proof is all but impossible thanks to the order that destroyed the vast majority of documents relating to the program. While no direct, provable link exists still, the timing and focus on the reprogramming societal norms through quote-unquote games does closely seem to mirror MKUltra's infiltration of the counterculture to study behavior modification. By the late 50s, Petty expanded to a 300-acre farm in rural Virginia dubbed The Farm, or Adventure. Here, a core group of a dozen followers engaged in self-sufficiency projects, mock economics, and ESP experiments. Petty styled himself as the game caller, orchestrating scenarios to reveal people's, quote, true personalities. Former members recall calling him the student or the pathfinder, believing that he could peer into their very souls. As the 1960s dawned, Petty briefly retired from his leadership role to test the group's independence, a tactic akin to MKUltra's isolation studies. By 66, amid the heart of the hippie boom, he reconvened in D.C., formalizing the Finders, which is short, by the way, for Finders of the Future, apparently. Now, with roughly 40 members, they operated from urban warehouses, vans, and the Virginia farm, blending New Age spirituality with practical ventures like pet training being used as fronts. As the years rolled into the 70s, the Finders would continue to grow and evolve, expanding their numbers to around 100 members. Emphasizing child rearing without societal indoctrination, kids were raised communally, often separated from parents in weaning processes to foster independence, practices that would later be scrutinized as trauma-based conditioning. Activities would include things like high-field experiments, where young children were left in pastures for exploration, supposed to build resilience through minimal supervision. Petty's intelligence connections would also deepen during these years. Members worked for Future Enterprises, Inc., a CIA-linked firm for computer training. Another associate, ex-Green Beret Ronald Allman, lived in a rural property with quote-unquote lots of medicine. There's evidence that the Finders doubled as a CIA asset for agent training or disrupting activism such as MKUltra's use of cults, the Manson family for example, to discredit the counterculture via controlled chaos. If you're interested in that angle, I really can't recommend picking up Tom O'Neill's book, by the way. Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s is a fantastic book, a really interesting read. He didn't even try to write a book, he just kind of got into this, researching it for like an article, I believe, and got all wrapped up in it. And I think he spent like 20 years or more just going through the stuff that he was finding and putting it in that book, and it's a very eye-opening book. Other known activities of the finders were animal sacrifices, documented in photos as quote-unquote biology lessons, which also leaned towards a darker, more satanic cult overtone, or even align with trauma-based induction techniques that were explored in MKUltra's many side projects. By the time the 80s came around, the group maintained properties in D.C., like the warehouse at 1307 4th Street Northeast, a duplex, as well as 2 other properties aside from the farm in Virginia, such as another 90-acre farm in Madison County and the Culpeper Theater. They somehow amassed at least $2 million in assets, living anti-bureaucratically while Petty strolled streets observing like a perpetual student. I feel it's worth at least pointing out that their choice of properties in Virginia and D.C. also put them in immediate proximity to CIA headquarters and strongholds. They would continue building through the late 70s and into the mid-80s, which brings us to where we started, February 4th, 1987, in Tallahassee's Mayor's Park, where 2 well-dressed Finders members, Douglas Ammerman and Michael Houlihan, aka Howell, were arrested with 6 unkept children: Mary Arrico, John Paul Arrico, Max Livingston, Benjamin Franklin Newth, a hell of a name, Honeybee Evans, another hell of a name, and B.B. Said, all appearing dirty, covered in bug bites, underfed, and apparently living out of a van with an understandably horrible odor emanating from it. The men would tell the Tallahassee PD that they were en route to Mexico for a school for brilliant children, but were evasive when asked about where the kids' parents were. When interviewed, one of the older children would reference the game caller and weaning from their moms. An investigation would immediately commence that would culminate in a raid on the D.C. warehouse and duplex, and what would be uncovered was appalling. The FBI and Customs Joint Task Force would seize computers, photos of naked children in rituals, goat dismemberment albums titled The Execution of Henrietta and Igor. The raids on the Virginia farms, as far as I can tell from the declassified but still heavily redacted FBI documents, would yield no evidence of crimes. All totaled, the raids uncovered evidence of brainwashing and rituals, including children in chains and animal bloodletting, interpreted as cult abuse but defended as being for educational purposes. The FBI and Customs would also examine the case for evidence of interstate trafficking. Despite all of this, 3 days later, on February 10th, police would state that they found no evidence of actual crimes, and the FBI would back away from the case. The children's mothers would reclaim the children by late February, explaining the reason for the trip as being an adventure. By March 4th, all charges in the case would be dropped completely, explained away as just an alternative lifestyle group, and the evidence is mere satanic panic, a term that we see used over and over, especially during these cases that occurred in the 80s. In 93, however, a leaked Customs report would reveal that the probe was actually dropped at the instruction of the CIA, which they classified the group as a, quote, internal matter, and then classified all of the records as secret. No surprise that a 94 DOJ review of the case found no cover-up, but FBI files in our folder that were released in 2019 confirm intelligence community scrutiny for child sex trafficking with, quote, satanic overtones, which only served to further fuel suspicions that the finders were a CIA-protected operation, possibly extending MKUltra's legacy into child indoctrination or blackmail networks, echoing other parallel scandals like Franklin and Epstein. In time, the name of the finders slowly faded from the collective conscience, but questions still linger for those who remember and who dare to ask. Was Petty's game his own, or like so many other scandals during this period, part of a larger intelligence play? Considering the CIA's efforts to silence the whole affair, chances are we'll never know. Chapter 4. Casa Pia. Throughout this episode, we've established a pattern, a global web of corruption where the powerful prey on the weak. From Franklin's elite ties to the finders' CIA shadows, we've seen the same setups and elements and the same complicity and cover-ups over and over. Now for a case that hits almost every note of this dark symphony, a trip across the Atlantic to Portugal to discuss the Casa Pia scandal, a case that serves as a mirror to Franklin, further driving home how the playbook repeats across borders. First though, let's set the scene. Casa Pia isn't some obscure shadowy backroom. It's one of Europe's oldest institutions, founded in 1780, as a beacon for Portugal's orphaned and abandoned kids. By the late 20th century, this network of Lisbon orphanages and schools housed thousands of children from broken homes, the kind society forgets. But according to police reports from 2002, it became a hunting ground. We're talking systemic sexual abuse, spanning at least 15 to 20 years, from the late 80s into the early 2000s. And the predators involved? Well, not just low-level staff, but politicians, TV stars, doctors, and lawyers. The spark ignited in December 2002 when Portuguese media finally broke the story and their silence about it. A judicial police investigation detailed in their official 2002 report over 4,500 pages of interviews and evidence uncovered allegations from more than 100 witnesses. Only 32 victims, however, were officially recognized in court, all of them minors, mostly boys aged 10 to 16. These weren't isolated incidents either. Trial transcripts from the 2004 proceedings paint a chilling picture of organization. A key figure in the story, Carlos Silvino, known as Bibi, a Casa Pia driver and janitor, acted as the procurer. According to victim testimonies entered into these transcripts, he groomed the boys with promises of favors, then shuttled them to the private apartments, hotels, or even directly to political offices for abuse. More than rumors or testimony, medical exams cited in police reports confirmed physical trauma consistent with the children's accounts. Now, on to where Franklin parallels really stand out, the people involved. The trials kicked off in September of 2004 in Lisbon's Boa Ora court before becoming too big and the media attention being too great that it had to be moved later to the Monsanto court. And then it would be moved one more time in January of 2005 to the former Santa Clara Military Court, where it would remain for the rest of the proceedings. The trial would drag on for years, with appeals all the way to the Supreme Court of Justice. In 2010, the final ruling convicted 7 defendants based on those ironclad testimonies and reports. Carlos Silvino was slammed with 18 years for 11 counts of aggravated sexual abuse and trafficking kids to others. His sentence would be reduced slightly after an appeal, but the transcripts detail how he enabled a network, much like Spence and King Jr. from Franklin's foster care abuses. Then there's Carlos Cruz, a name many of you likely won't recognize, but he was very well known in Portugal as the face of Portuguese TV and the host of the popular kids show Zip Zap. He would be convicted on 2 counts and sentenced to 7 years and 9 months. Victims testified that he abused them at upscale residences, and the court found their stories credible without even needing DNA. Another big name to come out in court was Paulo Pedroso, a high-ranking Socialist Party politician and former labor minister. Pedroso would be arrested in 2003 based on a police report from the year before citing a victim's direct accusations. It would be his case that exposed the cracks in the judicial system, though, because in 2008, the court acquitted him for, quote, lack of corroboration, citing that one testimony wasn't enough, according to transcripts. Sound familiar? It's that Franklin grand jury vibe, where connected elites lead to insufficient evidence and drop charges. Other connections in the case included Artur Alves, a journalist sentenced to 8 years, Hugo Barrero, a dentist given 5 years, and Manuel Abrantes, a Casa Pia employee who was given 5 years. The 2010 judgment laid it all out in a whopping 1,200 pages, a pattern of grooming, transport, and elite access with money and gifts used as lures. It is also the cover-up that makes Casa Pia a node in our web. Those 2002 police reports, for example, they hit roadblocks immediately. Jurisdictional fights delayed key evidence collection for months, and transcripts mentioned missing files, as well as some witnesses claiming intimidation. Investigative journalism from Publico in 2003 quoted directly from reports, revealing how early warnings were ignored or intentionally buried to protect powerful people. Take Teresa Costa Macedo, a former Casa Pia teacher. In 2003 testimony entered into the trial records, she described witnessing abuse as far back as the 80s and reported it in 82. Her statement read, quote, I saw the boys being taken away, and when I spoke up, I was told to mind my business, end quote. Nothing happened. Espresso's coverage of the trials confirms this, citing prosecutors' notes on institutional resistance. The Portuguese judicial police first accused the caretakers of Casa Pia state-run children's home of abuse in 81, citing the raping of dozens of children over a period of 30 years, even though some of the abuse reports start even before the Carnation Revolution in 74. Police would accuse the perpetrators of providing kids to men from Portugal and other countries, including prominent public figures and politicians. But these early allegations would go nowhere and didn't result in any sort of legal action, highlighting a clear example of institutional complicity. The accusations that surfaced in 2002 directly indicated the involvement of politicians, diplomats like UNESCO Ambassador Jorge Rito, who would eventually be sentenced up to 18 years for his role, as well as media personalities and stars, all of whom were accused of conspiring in a pedophilia ring that had operated in secret and with institutional protection for decades. The pressure put on the media was real as well. Portuguese outlets like Público faced legal threats for publishing victim stories in 2002. The investigation would take 8 years to finally yield convictions, justice delayed, and still, in several cases, denied entirely. And while 7 people would go down in the end, dozens of others accused, including several more elites, walked free completely. The court acknowledged systemic failures at Casa Pia, but stopped short of probing into the wider network. Several of the anonymized testimonies in the transcripts speak to the human cost. Quote, "They took us to houses where men in suits waited. We had no one to tell." End quote. While 32 victims were eventually recognized, estimates from the report suggest that hundreds more victims were intimidated into silence. So what does the Casa Pia case tell us about this broader web that we've been looking at? Elite involvement? Check. Politicians and media stars protected by the system. Institutional cover-ups? Absolutely. Delayed probes, missing files, and ignored whistleblowers. From buried reports in the 70s and 80s to 2002 when the files were so mishandled, it's the same playbook. It's always the same playbook. Exploit the most vulnerable, deny with insufficient evidence, and systemic protection of those involved. When you see this enough, they start to look less and less like one-off tragedies or coincidental similarities, and much more like glimpses into a system that is designed to obscure the truth and often control the powerful at the expense of our most vulnerable. Chapter 5. Kincora Boys Home. Our web doesn't stop in Lisbon. It continues to stretch out and across the water to Belfast in Northern Ireland and to another significant node in our web, Kincora Boys Home. This isn't just another abuse case, though. It's a scandal where British intelligence, the MI5, cast a long shadow with evidence suggesting that they were well aware of the horrors taking place early on, but rather than acting on the behalf of the innocent child victims, they chose to let it fester in order to gain leverage during the Troubles, which was a conflict that took place in Northern Ireland over whether or not North Ireland should remain under the rule of the UK or leave the UK and join a united Ireland. And it lasted from the late 60s all the way to the late 90s, giving rise to resistance elements like the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, as well as the Irish National Liberation Army, INLA. It was a very ugly struggle that still garners strong reactions from both sides even today. Like Franklin's rumored FBI ties, Kincora exposed how agencies have a history of shielding predators so long as it serves their agendas. Picture Belfast in the 70s, a war zone, bombs and division, where state oversight for places like Kincora Boys Home for teens 13 to 18 from broken backgrounds slipped through the cracks entirely. Typically housing 10 to 20 kids at a time under the health board, it became a site of systemic abuse from the late 60s to the 80s. The 1980 Royal Ulster Constabulary Police Report, partially declassified, confirmed at least 10 victims, though the 84 Hughes inquiry estimated more like 40 kids assaulted over 2 decades. Trial transcripts from the Belfast Crown Court in 81 detail grim mechanics, 3 staff members convicted on 25 charges. William McGrath, warden and loyalist, Tara group member, was sentenced to 4 years for 15 counts of abuse and grooming boys in the dorms. Raymond Semple, deputy, was given 5 years for 6 indecent assaults. Joseph Maines, the housemaster, got 6 years for buggery and assault. Medical exams, as in Casa Pia, backed up the boys' stories. The web grows even darker with MI5's murky involvement. Declassified documents from 1982 show a telex directing that, quote, "No serving or former of the security service should be interviewed by the police," end quote, blocking Royal Ulster Constabulary efforts to question senior MI5 officer Ian Cameron. Whistleblower Brian Gimmel, an Army intelligence officer, submitted a report in 75 to 76, but was ordered to, quote, "stop digging and forget about it." He would later tell victim Richard Kerr, quote, "That's the thing that hits me, that if I really pushed this thing through in 75, 76, you could have been rescued. I'm sorry." Colin Wallace, another Army info officer, penned a 1974 memo warning that, quote, destitute boys were being systematically sodomized by members of Kincora's staff and were being supplied for abuse to prominent figures in unionist politics. He claims MI5 monitored McGrath, a suspected informant, but didn't act and instead exploited the abuse for blackmail and leverage. Victims paint a hauntingly grim picture. Gary Hoy recalled, quote, Joe Maines had a room. His door was always locked, and I remember well-dressed men used to go in with children and the doors was locked, end quote. Richard Kerr, trafficked to London, said police, quote, intimidated him to skip the 81 trial, alleging state agencies had direct knowledge and traded silence for intel. Quote, all investigations and inquiries to date have failed to expose the full extent of the abuse, end quote. Direct evidence of a cover-up is woven all throughout the Kincora story. A 1977 RUC report on complaints was ignored. Social workers' 1976 alarms were dismissed. The 82 Terry inquiry whitewashed the story, focusing only on staff members. Hughes in 84 found no blackmail proof but slammed oversight failures. The 2017 HIA inquiry faulted MI5 for destroying files and lacking compulsion powers. As Amnesty International noted, quote, there are long-standing claims that MI5 blocked one or more police investigations, a terrible indictment which raises the specter of countless vulnerable boys having forced further years of brutal abuse. Wallace summed it up by saying, quote, there is no irrefutable evidence that previous inquiries were deliberately engineered to mislead Parliament by concealing the role of government agencies in covering up the abuses. Based on declassified documents, whistleblower testimonies, and inquiry findings, MI5's awareness of the abuses at Kincora appears to date back to at least the mid-70s, despite officially claiming ignorance all the way into the 80s. The most likely intention for allowing it to go on for so long, based on a preponderance of evidence from whistleblowers, declassified documents, and recent analysis, was to use the abuse for blackmail and intel gathering on loyalist paramilitary groups for leverage throughout the Troubles. William McGrath, Kincora housemaster and leader of the far-right loyalist group Tara, was suspected of being an MI5 informant agent since the 60s. He was allegedly blackmailed into providing intel on other loyalist groups, such as the Ulster Defense Association, or UDA, as well as Red Hand Commandos. In a 1999 book by Martin Dillon, he makes the claim that McGrath was an employee of MI5 and was also blackmailed for this purpose. Amnesty International describes the MI5's alleged complicity in the case as, quote, one of the biggest scandals of our age, noting claims that MI5 actively blocked investigations in order to protect its own intelligence gathering operation. Revelations about Kincora have continued to come out to this day. In his 2025 book, Kincora, Britain's Shame, journalist Chris Moore provides fresh insights from secret MI5 documents that confirm McGrath indeed was an MI5 asset and demonstrates evidence of a broader cover-up. The book also links Lord Mountbatten, the first Earl of Burma, to abusing Kincora boys in 1977, alleging MI5 and the establishment covered it up. Victim Arthur Smythe claimed Mountbatten raped him twice at age 11, stating, quote, he was a pedophile and people need to know him for what he was. The Kincora story is a deep and dark rabbit hole that we simply don't have enough time to really fully cover the way it needs to be. But Kincora's threads, vulnerable kids preyed on, warnings that went ignored or were actively buried, like Franklin's red flags, intelligence shadows, protecting elites, gathering blackmail, incomplete justice, only 3 being convicted, broader network remaining untouched. It's not conspiracy, it's a system thriving on silence and using the darkest urges of powerful elites for leverage and control, all proven by declassified docs and survivor testimony. For now, we pivot to our final node, McMartin Preschool, where supposed evidence, like tunnels under a school, leaves us questioning just how deep this web goes. Hold that thought, Truth Seeker. Our board is almost complete now. Now that Kincora's pen is set in our board, Belfast boys betrayed, MI5's shadowy protection of predators in the name of intel, it's time to move back to the U.S., Manhattan Beach, California to be exact, for our final case this evening, the McMartin Preschool scandal. This isn't just a preschool scandal, of which there are sadly plenty. It resulted in the longest and most costly trial in American history. All told, it took 7 years and $15 million. And in the end, just like Franklin and many others, there were 0 convictions. This case is a wild one, so if you're ready, let's go ahead and jump in and try to find out how deep this web really goes. It's August 1983 at McMartin Preschool. an institution that was founded some 23 years prior in 1966 by Virginia McMartin, which went on to gain a reputation before this date as being a suburban haven for 100 kids at a time aged 2 to 5. The area's parents had come to trust Virginia, along with her daughter Peggy and her grandson Ray Buckley. All of that was about to unravel in epic fashion, though, and spark one of the biggest controversies in the history of California. One of the students' mothers, Judy Johnson, would tip the first domino over when she would accuse Ray Buckley of molesting her 2.5-year-old son. Her claims, reported in the LA Times in September of 1983, would spiral. Sodomy, satanic rituals, Ray as the devil. She would later be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Regardless of the role that may or may not have played in her initial story, it would still ignite a powder keg of accusations that would quickly become national news. On September 8th, local police would send out a letter to the 200 current and most recent parents of McMartin students. In clear language, it said, "Check your kids for signs of abuse." This letter would extend that initial spark into a wildfire of panic. The Children's Institute International would soon step in, led by social worker Key McFarland. They would quickly get to work interviewing over 400 kids using anatomically correct dolls and pointed questions like the standard at the time of, "Can you show me on the doll where he touched you?" By 1984, 41 children are deemed to be victims, alleging horror straight out of a nightmare. Secret rooms under the school, tunnels for escape, rabbits and turtles and other animals mutilated and bled out, and then the blood from them given to the children, forcing them to drink it as sacrifice in occult rituals. Nude quote-unquote games with names like Naked Movie Star, as well as off-site abuse at churches or a place that they referred to as the Purple House. Some of the claims seeming to come from imaginations of potentially confused, abused, or possibly just lying children, such as flying witches, lion attacks, and hot air balloon trips. Dr. Astrid Hager's 1984 exams of the children would find that 80% of the children she examined had been molested. She would reach the determination largely through the use of a magnifying device called a colposcope, which she claimed allowed her to detect small scarring patterns in the genital and rectal areas. These claims would be highly disputed by other doctors and a nationally recognized child abuse expert who was called in by the defense team, Dr. David Paul. Police would soon move in to scour the school, churches, and homes of the preschool staff, saying that they found no evidence of semen. Weird claim, but okay. No photos and no obvious ritual sites. Despite all of that, by 1984, 7 defendants, Virginia, Peggy, and Ray, along with 3 teachers and 1 teaching aide, were all facing 321 counts for 48 kids claiming abuse, and supported by psychological or physical exams. A 20-month preliminary hearing from 84 to 86 would draw eyes from around the world and erupt into a media circus. Kids would testify to rituals, but inconsistencies would be pointed to during the cross-examinations. It probably bears mentioning once more, though. These were mostly very young children, and they were up against an experienced defense attorney in a very uncomfortable environment. Prosecutor Lael Rubin calls it a betrayal of trust. Defense attorney Daniel Davis refers to it as simply being, quote, hysteria run amok. The DA, Ira Reiner, would end up dropping 5 of the defendants' charges in '86, citing incredibly weak evidence, per the New York Times January 18, 1986 article. Only Ray, who was 25 at the time, and Peggy would stand trial, the first of which would last from 1987 to 1989 and be a marathon, 65-count, 121-witness called, $15 million spent trial. Only 9 of the children would be called to testify, though. Their words were chilling. A now 10-year-old girl who was only 4 at the time of the alleged abuse would say in the 1987 transcripts, quote, "Ray touched me down there, in a secret room under the floor." Another child in 1988 would recall, quote, "They killed rabbits and made us drink the blood." The Child Institute International methods would come under scrutiny, however, and serve to undermine their testimony a lot in court. Videotapes presented by the defense team show McFarland pushing, quote, "Can you tell me about the naked games?" was just one of the phrases cited as evidence of leading the children's statement and coercion. One child would admit in court, quote, "I said what they wanted me to say so they would stop asking." The jury would go on to acquit Peggy, but hangs on Ray 9-3 for an acquittal. A retrial in 1990 for 13 counts hangs again 7-5. On July 27th of 1990, the charges would be officially dropped. No convictions. But before you write this case off as childhood delusions, impressionable minds being manipulated by adults with agendas, or, as many in the media framed it at the time, just another case of quote-unquote satanic panic, this wasn't where this story ended. While many of the eyes that had closely watched the trials moved on to the next scandal of the era, some very compelling developments would soon come to pass. Remember how many of the kids described tunnels or underground passages used for abuse or hiding of the evidence? A little later in 1990, some of the parents would join together to hire archaeologist E. Gary Stickle, who holds a Ph.D. from UCLA, for a $55,000 dig with ground-penetrating radar underneath the preschool. In 1993, he would publish a 185-page report which would turn the satanic panic narrative on its head and call the jury's determination into question. Among the anomalies he would uncover would be an entrance/exit tunnel under the foundation of the west wall beneath classroom number 4, which was also confirmed by consulting geologist Don Michael Ph.D., and was clearly distinguished despite attempts to backfill by loose, disturbed soil and the artifacts contained within it. Much more detail on the tunnel is available in the archaeological report in our files, but I'll do my very best to hit some of the main highlights here. Of note is that classroom number 4 was the room that Ray Buckley taught in. Several chambers were identified within the hand-dug tunnels, and evidence of their use and construction was also identified by artifacts as well as cinder blocks and wooden posts which were used to support layers of plywood covered with tar paper, which made up the roof of the underground structures. Another tunnel was identified which ran from the bathroom off of the offices in classroom 1 that extended to the front yard of the triplex next door, which was concealed from the street by a 3-car garage. The children had described in their testimony an entrance and exit tunnel in the triplex yard precisely where the tunnel and exit were found. A 39 by 41 inch area was uncovered under a hole that was cut in the neighbor's bathroom floor, which was excavated and subsequently filled. A white plastic plate with 3 hand-drawn pentagrams and green paint on it was found by the archaeologists in the stratified dirt in the play yard, which, according to the archaeologist, was drawn by an adult and not part of the plate's original design. Within the school, no doorknobs were on the door to classroom number 3, only a deadbolt. Each classroom had on and off light switches labeled as, quote, fire alarms, but didn't ever connect to the fire station. Instead, they were clearly used as an alarm within the school. Altogether, over 2,000 artifacts would be recovered from beneath the school's floors, including over 100 animal bones, which would seem to possibly align with the children's testimony of animal sacrifices and rituals taking place in the secret rooms beneath the school. The case was also plagued by unidentified strangers that the children spoke of who were also alleged to have abused them. People in suits and nice clothes who were never introduced to the kids but would either visit the school or be the cause of some of the alleged trips the children were taken on. Despite the outcome of the trials and the dismissal by the media, many questions about what really took place at McMartin still remain, even all these years later. The archaeologist Stickle would write in his report, quote, "The tunnel findings are consistent with the children's accounts of secret rooms and access points. A 2019 FBI memo, which was declassified as part of the Finders file, mentions McMartin tunnels as well, but despite the archaeological report, calls their extent unproven, tying to cult rumors that appear over and over throughout these cases, but officially at least, tend to always remain unproven. While skeptics would fire back against the archaeological findings, Stickle's recovery of bones and other evidence, as well as the ground-penetrating radar findings, are not easily dismissed. Some of the kids in a 1990 LA Times follow-up article stood firm, saying, quote, "I know what happened, even if they say I made it up." McMartin's threads weave tight with those of Franklin's. Vulnerable kids, preschoolers, foster children, preyed on by the adults they trusted. Evidence, tunnels, bones, or conspiracy of silence, swept aside. Institutions, DA, media, label it as hysteria or a hoax. No convictions despite the $15 million trial in 7 years. Scream protection. Protection from a deeper web. Otherwise, one would think that the accusations could have been definitively proven far quicker. Were the alleged rituals really just mass panic, hysteria, or did the system once again bury the truth? As always, I've done my very best to give you the facts, to provide you all the available evidence, and to let you ultimately make your mind up for yourself. As far as the McMartin case is concerned, full disclosure, there seems to be a counter intended to discredit virtually every piece of evidence. Stickle uncovered some very compelling evidence. 1,600 to 2,000 artifacts cataloged, over 200 bones of cows, lambs, pigs, chickens, and even dogs, all seemingly professionally butchered, suggesting possible ritual use. The dated items that all largely date from times after the construction of the school. Other debris like the wooden posts, plywood, tar paper, charcoal, electrical wiring, curtain rod rings, etc., as well as that 2019 FBI memo confirming tunnels but ordering a stop to the digging, potentially pointing to a broader cover-up. Despite all of that, skeptics, including the defense attorneys, argued that the tunnels were not modern structures but rather pre-existing features or just misinterpretations of the data. They argued that the disturbed soil and items weren't from the tunnels but from a trash pit that was supposedly there before the construction of the school, that the newer items had just been drug in by rats or other animals. Other critiques point towards confirmatory bias on behalf of Stickle, saying that he ignored GPR results that didn't show tunnels in favor of the ones that did, and accused him of not considering alternative theories like rubbish pits, while behavioral analysis suggested his conclusions were influenced by parental pressure. Even the 2019 FBI release in the finder's files that references tunnels disputes their scope, noting, quote, "no conclusive evidence of ritual abuse." While most of the cases I've brought to you in this series demonstrate strong or undeniable evidence, McMartin is a bit more polarizing. I think that it is important to be completely transparent about that, though. Despite its ambiguity, McMartin still leaves a lot of questions unanswered. Its lack of convictions, despite it being one of the longest trials and the most expensive trial ever, and despite physical evidence like the animal bones, tunnels, and definitive proof that at least 6 of the kids involved had been sexually abused, although, like with Franklin, it would be framed as abuse that could have just happened at home or somewhere else, all seemingly point towards the same systemic denial and victim silencing, failures in the system, and unresolved truths that we've seen buried or swept aside and dismissed throughout all of these cases. McMartin's ambiguity, in my opinion, isn't a weakness, but rather a stark example of how systems bury credible leads like the tunnels and consistent child claims under dismissive pejoratives like hysteria, and darker elements like animal sacrifices or satanic cult activity as merely satanic panic. Even if some of the McMartin testimonies were a bit out there, or tainted by coercive interviews and potentially leading questions, many of the details from across the 41 children, the secret rooms, animal killings, echo the credible victim accounts in Franklin, Casa Pia, and Kincora. So regardless of which side of the proverbial fence you find yourself on with regards to McMartin, I felt that including it underscores how authorities discredit vulnerable voices to protect powerful structures, a pattern that we see repeated time and time again. So yes, McMartin is messier than Casa Pia's court convictions or Kincora's MI5 telexes, coerced testimonies, and wild claims of flying witches, how satanic panic muddled the waters. So why include it? Because McMartin's ambiguity is the point. Those tunnels uncovered by archaeologist Gary Stickle in '93, 9-foot chambers, dated Disney bags from '83, over 100 animal bones, all line up eerily close to what the kids describe, and yet the system dismissed it as a trash pit. Sound familiar? Well, it should. It's Franklin's victims branded as liars, Kincora's files being sealed until 2065, the redactions that black out so much of the finder's reports. McMartin further illustrates how this web thrives on doubt, dismissed physical evidence, and silences child victims. It isn't an outlier. It's the system's blueprint for denial, and it carries forward many of the same themes that we see pop up over and over in these stories. Chapter 7. The Big Picture. As we step back from the proverbial corkboard this evening, the Penns, Franklin, Epstein, Dutroux, the Finders, Casa Pia, Kincora, and McMartin don't just mark isolated tragedies as they would have us believe, but instead they form a sprawling web, one that hints at a coordinated network far beyond random acts of abuse. This isn't mere coincidence or isolated corruption, it's a pattern, one so insidious that no one wants to see it, and so vile that no one wants to believe it. One that intelligence agencies and shadow elite elements exploit the vulnerable, children, orphans, foster kids, to ensnare the powerful, weaponizing their darkest urges for uniform agreement, for compliance, all seemingly in service of a larger hidden agenda, maintaining control over global politics, finance, and power structures, ensuring that dissent is silenced and loyalties are bought through blackmail. So now that you have the full picture, let's trace the threads and see what stands out. Starting with Franklin, a Midwestern credit union scandal masking a child prostitution and blackmail ring, where victims like Paul Bonacci allege being trafficked to high-level figures, including ties to the White House under George H.W. Bush. Investigations were quashed, evidence vanished. The FBI deleted some 90,000 records aside from seizing the work of Gary Caradori, who, based on the evidence, appears to have been killed before he could blow the story wide open. And even after the fact, a documentary detailing it all gets pulled before even airing and buried. Whispers of CIA involvement linger, including Bonacci's claims of involvement in MKUltra-style mind control programs taking place at the same military base that his brother would later be found shot to death at. We will dig into that a bit more in the BTR next week, but this case wasn't just pedophilia, it was leverage. Turn influential men into puppets through compromat. Epstein amplifies it. Not just a financier, but an alleged intelligence asset, recruited via Ghislaine Maxwell's Mossad-linked father, Robert Maxwell, running a blackmail factory not dissimilar to what Craig Spence had been working with King to accomplish. Flight logs and settlements like JP Morgan's $300 million point to a system where minors were trafficked to politicians, CEOs, and scientists, their abuses secretly filmed for control. While I had to greatly condense his story to cover all that I needed to in this episode, he has ties to Harvard, DARPA contractors, and foreign intel agencies, suggesting a global operation. Use sex with the vulnerable to bind the powerful, ensuring compliance in policy, tech, and finance. The agenda? Influence elections, direct corporate empires, and steer international alliances, all while the innocent pay the price. The Dutroux case in Belgium echoes it. A serial abuser whose dungeons held girls for elite networks, with police ignoring leads for years. Victims spoke at parties with politicians and businessmen, their traumas exploited for silence and favors. Belgian intel whispers of a protective ring, where abuse ensured loyalty in EU power circles. The Finders cult takes it even darker, a group caught with abused children, linked to the CIA through declassified memos showing internal investigations that halted real probes seeking to expose the truth. Rituals, mind control experiments, patient zero for Epstein-style conspiracies, where vulnerable kids were tools for behavioral programming and elite leverage. Portugal's Casa Pia, hundreds of orphan boys abused by politicians, diplomats, and media figures, with delayed justice until 2010. Are we noticing a pattern yet? While there is no direct evidence of intel agency involvement, the scale, high-level protection, media suppression suggests a network where darkest urges bought silence. There were also links to European power brokers, like so many others. Then to North Ireland's Kincora boys' home, where sexual abuse with upper-level MI5 knowledge goes back to as early as 1974, per declassified telexes. Warden William McGrath, a loyalist informant, was allegedly blackmailed for intel during the Troubles period. Here, vulnerability fueled compliance. Abuse overlooked to control paramilitaries and politicians. And finally, back to the U.S. and McMartin Preschool. Tunnels, bones, ritual claims dismissed as satanic panic, the conspiracy theory pejorative of the 80s, used to explain all of it. But Stickles' dig found structures in the size and location of the children's stories, linked to satanic networks with intel overlaps via Finders parallels. It shows how ambiguity shields the agenda and possibly further illustrates how trauma is used as a tool to fracture and control. Now, with all of our pins in place and our strings connected, let's step back. Intelligence fingerprints everywhere. CIA and Finders, MI5 and Kincora, Mossad and Epstein, FBI interference back at Franklin. The vulnerable just dangled as bait, their abuse not simply for pleasure of twisted minds, but recorded to sink the hook into the powerful, ensuring politicians vote as told, CEOs fund agendas, scientists share secrets and serve as experts to push out agendas. The larger game? Global control. Steering wars, economics, tech. Think NSO spyware and Palantir surveillance, for example. It's MKUltra, only evolved. Trauma bonds loyalty, darkest urges ensure obedience to the plan, all for the real elite's vision of order and control. Franklin wasn't important for me to cover just to shed light on that one case. It was important to demonstrate a blueprint, one that we see copied, pasted, and repeated all throughout modern history, and all throughout the world. It wasn't an anomaly, it was part of a web, a pattern repeated time and time again. It wasn't just important to show that it happened, but to show that it can, it does, and it will happen again. It was a call to dig a little deeper, to speak a little louder, and above all to question the powerful and hold them accountable when the system that benefits from them fails to do so. The agenda thrives in the shadows, and grows more and more powerful each time people are silenced, each time they're complicit, or are apathetic to the suffering of its many vulnerable victims. We hold the key to stopping it, though. Us and us alone. When we choose to shine our light into those dark corners, we expose it, and it grows weaker every time that we do it. It can only thrive if we choose to ignore it, choose to forget the last time, or fail to prevent the next one. We all have a role to play in fixing the rot at the heart of the system. The only question is, will you choose to speak up, or will you become complicit by failing to do so? That choice is solely on you. And with that, we conclude our deep dive investigative series into the Franklin cover-up and some of the elite trafficking blackmail rings just like it. Trust me when I say these are not the only ones. They have infiltrated virtually all areas of society and the global economy, even right here in America, from the music industry to Hollywood, from politics to business. We see many of the same hallmarks of these setups. So if there is another one that you would like to hear me dig into a little more at some point, or even one of these like Epstein that I couldn't hope to fully cover in a single segment of this one episode, leave me a comment, shoot me an email, or drop it in live Discord chat for this or any other episode, and I'll be happy to look into it. Also, if you ever have a tip about a show or a show suggestion, just reach out. I'll reply to every single message or email comment that I get, because you are all why I do this. The show is meaningless without you listening, sharing, and interacting with it. I genuinely hope that you feel this series was worth doing, and that you got something out of listening to it. It was easily the most difficult one to put together, which seems to be an ongoing trend around here of pushing into more and more difficult to research and summarize topics. I'm going to be honest with you though. This will be the last big series for this season, and we have some much lighter and easily digestible content coming up. A few fun ones, some paranormal stuff coming for Halloween, some historical mysteries coming towards the end of the season. Should be good times. Thank you as always for listening. Do me a small favor if you're able to, and please share the podcast with at least one friend that you think might enjoy it. This season's numbers are off to the slowest start that we've had yet, and I really can't keep pouring the time and effort into these that's required if no one is listening. It's just too much of a strain in my life, and I've covered most of the big stories that I set out to cover over these 3 seasons anyway. I hate to even have to lay that on you tonight, but I will always be totally upfront and honest with you guys. So there it is. If you do enjoy the show or appreciate the work that goes into all of this, I really need those numbers to reflect it. Because everything that I do and that I provide is completely free. I have never asked for a single penny or sold a single second of your valuable and appreciated time to advertisers, and I never intend to. All that I ask is a small bit of effort required to help this type of real journalism actually reach people's ears. Helping to better inform people on important topics, keeping stories alive that affect our world, and shining a light into dark corners of elite and government corruption is all that I want from this. But I can't do it without your help. A sincere thank you to all of you who have continued to support and shared the show with others, or even just make it a point to stream these each and every time a new one drops. I truly can't thank those that do that enough. Got a new BTR coming up soon, another main episode just behind it. Doing my very best to keep content coming as quickly as I possibly can, without sacrificing the quality or putting episodes out just for the sake of content. I'll be back with all of you next week though, but until then, take care of yourselves out there, take care of each other whenever you can, and I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.